The laurel wreath was still wet when the chains were fitted. Rain slid off polished bronze and soaked into the hair of women who had once been dressed for council fires, not for conquest. They stood in a line that bent like a wounded spine before the Roman standards, their eyes fixed on the eagle that promised order and delivered erasure. Somewhere behind them, a chief's head cooled on a spear. Somewhere ahead, the road ran south, and the word peace was being sharpened into a blade. They had called the valley a place of treaties. It lay between two low hills and a river that smelled of iron in the spring. The tribes had come there to bargain after the last skirmish, believing the Roman oath sworn on salt and flame would hold. When the legions arrived at dawn, banners furled, helmets dull with mud, there was no charge. There was a reading of terms, a silence, and then the snap of discipline like winter breaking twigs. The chiefs were taken first, bound and named aloud, their wives ordered to watch, because Rome believed in lessons. Cassia watched from the edge of the line. She had not been a chief's wife long enough to forget how to stand. Her marriage to Brennus had been a winter arrangement, a knot tied in the cold for the sake of grain routes and peace. She had learned his breathing and sleep, his habit of counting steps before crossing water. Now she counted standards instead. 12 eagles. She knew what that meant. 12,000 men who did not forget orders. The centurion who paced before them spoke through a translator whose voice shook. The law was recited. Rebellion had consequences. Hostages would be taken. Lands would be surveyed. The wives of defeated chiefs would be kept until Rome was satisfied that memory itself had learned obedience. The words were clean. The meaning was not. Cassia felt it settle in her bones like frost. They were marched to a camp that grew from the ground as if summoned. Trenches, stakes, the square precision of tents. The legions moved with a calm that was worse than shouting. Everything had its place, including the women, set apart near the praetorium, where eyes could reach them from all sides. At dusk, a triumphal fire was lit, and the chiefs were paraded, alive for the moment, because Rome preferred its spectacles paced. Brennus did not look at Cassia when they brought him past. His face had been cut cleanly, as if a sculptor had practiced restraint. He met the ground with a steadiness that had once been a promise. Cassia wanted to call his name, but the camp swallowed sound. She understood then that Rome's power was not only steel, but the theft of voice. Night pressed in. The river whispered. Cassia was given a blanket that smelled of vinegar and old blood. Around her, other women breathed in patterns that betrayed fear held too long. One whispered prayers to gods whose names were older than Latin. Another stared without blinking, counting the stars as if they were exits. Cassia did not pray. She remembered her mother's counsel. Survive the first night, then decide who you will be. At the edge of the camp, a Roman officer stood alone, his cloak pulled tight. His name was Marcus Aelius Varro, and he had been given a task he did not want. He had been raised on stories of discipline and mercy as twins, of law as a shield. Now he watched the line of women and felt the weight of an order that would stain even obedience. He told himself Rome was a road, not a fire. Roads required sacrifices. He hated the thought that the road had learned to demand faces. In the morning, a census was taken. Names were written down with care that felt like mockery. Ages, kinship, marks of rank. Cassia answered when asked, her voice steady. She did not give Brennus's name. She said only that she had been born by the upper river, that she knew how to keep accounts, that she could read the old trademarks. The clerk paused, surprised. Marcus watched and said nothing. A small mercy, he thought, was still a mercy. The chiefs were executed at noon. The sound carried. Cassia felt the line shift as if a tide had pulled at their ankles. When it was done, the standards were turned toward the south. Orders were given. The women were to march at first light. Rome would teach them the meaning of custody, and through them, the meaning of fear. Cassia folded the blanket with care. She had chosen who she would be. She would remember everything, because memory too could be sharpened. As the camp settled, Cassia watched Marcus confer with his tribunes, the language of command clipped and distant. She studied the way Rome organized dread, turning it into routine, filing its edges until it fit inside a ledger. She thought of the valley again, of treaties spoken over water, of how trust could be trained to kneel. Around her, the women shifted closer, instinct drawing them into a shape that felt like shelter. Cassia felt responsibility settle, unwanted but firm. If survival was possible, it would be collective, measured in shared silence and borrowed warmth. Marcus returned to his tent and wrote a letter he would never send, describing a night without stars and a duty without rest. He sealed it anyway, because ritual mattered when meaning failed. Outside, the watch changed. Sandals scraped. Somewhere a soldier laughed, then stopped. The camp breathed, an animal fed and waiting. Cassia lay back and stared at the canvas above, tracing seams like constellations. She counted breaths until dawn seemed possible. The road would come. Rome would insist. Memory would travel with them, quiet and unbroken, waiting for the moment when roads turned and the eagle blinked at last. Hope survived quietly, sharpened by patience and listening. They were woken before dawn, when the camp still smelled of ash and wet leather, and the sky held no color worth naming. Orders moved faster than light, passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, until the women were standing with blankets rolled tight, wrists free but watched, feet numb in the cold. Rome preferred its captives intact. Damage complicated accounting. The road south revealed itself slowly, a pale ribbon pressed into the earth by generations of marching feet. Cassia stepped onto it and felt the difference at once. Paths wandered, roads commanded. Each mile was measured, drained, and forced. The women were arranged in columns of 5, flanked by legionaries whose shields reflected the morning like dull mirrors. No one was allowed to lag. No one was allowed to speak above a murmur. Silence was part of the discipline. By mid-morning, the valley was gone, replaced by scrub and stone. The river bent away, unwilling to follow them. Cassia focused on breath and cadence, on placing her feet where the woman ahead had stepped. Around her, the wives of chiefs moved with a dignity that had learned restraint too early. Some carried children, lifted and shifted with practiced care, though none of the children cried. Fear had taught them the price of sound. Marcus Varro rode at the column's edge, his horse stepping carefully on the packed earth. He kept his gaze forward, away from faces, because faces complicated duty. The order he carried was explicit. The women were to be preserved as leverage, displayed when useful, removed when not. Nothing more needed to be said. He told himself that distance was mercy, that enforcement without intimacy was the least harmful way to obey. At the first halt, water was rationed. Cassia noticed how the ladles were counted, how names were checked against wax tablets. She noticed which guards looked too long, which looked away too quickly. She spoke quietly to the woman beside her, a widow from the northern ridge whose name was Alice. They exchanged no plans, only small truths. Who had blisters? Who had strength left? Who needed help lifting a child? Care, Cassia knew, was resistance disguised as habit. The second day brought rain. Cloaks darkened. The road slicked, and a woman fell. A guard swore and hauled her up by the arm, too roughly. Marcus intervened with a gesture sharp as a blade. The guard flushed and stepped back. The woman was set upright, and the march resumed. Nothing was said, but Cassia felt a line had been drawn, thin and fragile. She stored the knowledge. At night, the camp was smaller than before, the perimeter tight. Fires were limited. The women were given bread and salted meat, enough to keep them moving. Cassia broke her portion carefully and shared it with a girl whose hands shook too badly to tear it herself. Stories were not told. Instead, memories were traded in fragments, each woman offering a detail she would not surrender. A river bend, a harvest song, a child's laugh. Custody, Cassia thought, went both ways. Marcus wrote reports by lamplight, his hand steady, his mind not. He recorded distances, conditions, compliance. He did not record the look on a child's face when the rain stopped. He did not record the way Cassia met his eyes once, briefly, not with hatred, but with assessment. He wondered which was worse. On the third day, they passed a milestone carved with the emperor's name. The letters were clean, recently cut. Rome marked its progress the way other peoples marked graves. Cassia touched the stone as she passed, just long enough to feel the grooves. She memorized the shape of the name, not to honor it, but to know it. Names mattered. They could be spoken later when speaking had weight again. Trouble came at a narrow bridge. The column slowed, compressed. A legionary behind grew impatient and struck a woman with the flat of his hand to move her forward. The sound cracked like a branch. Before Cassia could think, she stepped between them, her back straight, her hands open. She said nothing. The silence stretched. Marcus spurred his horse and was there, his voice low and absolute. The legionary backed away. The bridge held. The line moved. Cassia's heart hammered, but her face remained still. She had learned the value of stillness. That night, the women slept closer together. The road had taught them its lesson. Rome was not a storm to be endured and forgotten. It was weather, long and deliberate. Cassia lay awake and planned without naming it planning. She counted women. She counted days. She counted the small mercies and the costs attached to them. Marcus, in his tent, stared at the map and traced the route south with a finger. He imagined another road, one that curved away from what was written. He folded the map and set it aside. When dawn came again, the column formed without prompting. The road waited, patient as a judge. Cassia stepped forward with the others, memory secured like a blade beneath her cloak, unseen and kept sharp. The fortress at Arausio rose from the plain like a thought Rome refused to abandon. Its walls were not high, but they were exact, angles measured, stones fitted without flourish. It was a place designed to endure boredom and authority in equal measure. When the column arrived, the gates opened without ceremony, and the women were led inside as if they were supplies long expected. Cassia felt the change at once. Camps breathed, fortresses held their breath, sound flattened against stone, footsteps echoing with a finality that unsettled even the guards. Inside the walls, order thickened. Schedules were posted, horns sounded at fixed intervals. Everything had a time, including captivity. They were quartered in a former storehouse, cleared of grain and lined with pallets. Light entered through narrow slits high in the wall, turning dust into slow-moving constellations. The door closed with a bar dropped into place. It was not locked. Locks implied distrust. Rome preferred inevitability. A prefect arrived to explain their status. He was neat, efficient, his Latin clipped and precise. A translator followed, eyes downcast. The women were under protection, the prefect said. Their safety was guaranteed so long as their people remained compliant. They would be fed, counted, and presented when necessary. Any attempt at escape would be interpreted as defiance by their tribes. The consequences would be communal. He smiled at the end, as if clarity were kindness. Cassia listened without reacting. She watched the way the prefect avoided certain words, how he leaned on abstractions, protection, compliance, presentation. She understood then that Rome had perfected a language that made cruelty administrative. It was not the blade that broke people first, it was the form. Days settled into pattern. At dawn, bread and water. At mid-morning, a brief airing in the yard under watch. At dusk, soup thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl. Names were called twice daily. Cassia answered each time, careful to keep her voice unchanged. She learned the rhythm of the guards' shifts, the ones who counted accurately and the ones who guessed. She learned which women could not sleep without speaking and which needed silence like air. Marcus Varro arrived at Arausio on the second day. His orders had expanded. He was to oversee custody and ensure no incidents reached the governor's ears without explanation. He toured the fortress with the prefect, noting deficiencies, correcting small lapses. When they reached the storehouse, Marcus paused. He felt the weight of eyes behind the slits, the quiet attention of people who had learned to measure power quickly. He addressed the women through the translator. He repeated the terms, added assurances. He spoke of Rome's interest in stability. His voice was steady, practiced. When he finished, he met Cassia's gaze again, briefly. This time, she inclined her head, not in submission, but acknowledgement. He felt a strange relief, followed by shame. The first demonstration came without warning. A messenger arrived from the north with news of a skirmish, minor but inconvenient. The prefect decided on a reminder. 2 women were selected by lot to be displayed at the gate during the afternoon muster, visible to the auxiliary troops and the townspeople beyond. They were not harmed, they were made to stand, bound, beneath the eagle, while the prefect read a proclamation about order and consequence. Cassia watched from the slit as the sun moved and the women's shadows shortened. She saw the way the crowd looked and then looked away, how discomfort competed with obedience. She memorized the proclamation. She memorized the cadence. Rome repeated itself because repetition worked. That night, Cassia spoke softly to the others. Not speeches, instructions disguised as comfort. Stay together. Share food quietly. Remember who is missing and who returns. If you are taken, note the time. Note who watches. Knowledge, she said, was warmth. It kept you from freezing. A child fell ill on the 4th day. Fever, shallow breath. The guards hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene. Cassia sent Alice to request a medic, using the prefect's language carefully. Custody implied maintenance. Marcus authorized it when the request reached him. The medic came, gruff but competent. The child lived. The women exhaled as one. Cassia noted another line drawn, another cost paid. Marcus found himself lingering near the storehouse more often than duty required. He told himself he was inspecting. In truth, he was listening. He heard murmurs that were not prayers. He heard organization. It unsettled him more than screams would have. Rome knew how to crush noise. Quiet was harder. The governor arrived on the 7th day. He toured the fortress, approved the arrangements, praised the prefect's efficiency. He suggested the women be rotated through public view on market days. Visibility reinforced compliance, he said. Marcus nodded and said nothing. Cassia watched from the shadows and counted the governor's rings. That evening, Cassia made a choice. She approached the door when it opened for water and addressed the guard directly, using the little Latin she had learned from traders. She asked for tablets and charcoal to keep accounts, offering usefulness in exchange. The guard laughed, then shrugged. The request reached Marcus. He hesitated, then approved it. Utility justified exceptions. The tablets arrived. Cassia did not record accounts. She recorded names, days, absences. She recorded who had stood at the gate and for how long. She recorded the shape of Rome's order as it pressed down. When the lights dimmed, she traced the marks with her finger and committed them to memory. The price of order, Cassia understood, was paid in advance and collected later. Rome believed it had purchased silence. It did not yet know what it had financed instead. They were moved without announcement, woken before the horn and given time only to roll blankets and swallow bread. Arausio receded behind them as the dates closed with a sound like a verdict. The road waited again, pale and implacable, running south through low country where the soil turned white and brittle underfoot. This was an older road, its stones worn smooth by centuries of marching, its edges lined with markers that named victories no one remembered and defeats no one admitted. The column was larger now. Auxiliaries joined them, men recruited from places Rome had already broken and taught to enforce its peace. Their accents were strange, their eyes cautious. Cassia noted the shift. Empires learned to outsource cruelty. The women were reorganized, interspersed with other captives taken from recent operations. The air thickened with rumor. A village burned, a levy refused, a chief's brother fled. Each fragment carried weight. Cassia absorbed them without comment, fitting them into the growing map she carried behind her eyes. By the 3rd day, the road narrowed between limestone rises. The heat pressed down, the sky bleached and empty. A woman named Rhea stumbled, her foot caught between stones. A guard cursed and struck her shoulder with the butt of his spear. Not hard enough to kill, hard enough to teach. Rhea fell anyway. The column halted. Marcus Varro rode forward, anger sharp and controlled. He ordered the guard back, called for water. It was done quickly, efficiently. The auxiliaries watched, unreadable. Cassia knelt beside Rhea, helped her drink. She felt the tremor under Rhea's skin, the fear that went deeper than pain. "Breathe," Cassia murmured. "Count." Rhea nodded, clung to the instruction like a rope. When they stood again, the column moved on. The road accepted them. That night, camp was made near an abandoned shrine, its stones cracked, its offerings long gone. The firelight caught old carvings of gods whose names had been scraped away. Cassia sat with Alice and the others, distributing what food they had. She spoke quietly, naming tasks. Who would watch the children? Who would sleep nearest the door? Who would remember the guards' faces? Organization steadied them. It gave shape to fear. Marcus wrote by the fire, his reports growing longer, his sleep shorter. He had begun to notice patterns he did not like. The auxiliaries were less restrained. They had not been raised on Roman law, only on Roman reward. He issued warnings, increased patrols, reminded officers of orders. He did not write the word unspeakable, but it hovered in the margins of his thoughts like smoke. On the 5th day, it happened, not in the open, not with witnesses enough to stop it. A woman was taken from the line during a halt, led behind the rise where the road bent and sight lines failed. When she returned, her hair was torn loose, her eyes fixed on nothing. She did not cry, she did not speak. The guards said she had fallen. The auxiliaries laughed too quickly. Cassia felt the shift ripple through the women, a tightening, a drawing inward. She wrapped her cloak around the woman, whose name was Senna, and held her until the shaking stopped. She said nothing that would demand words Senna could not give. Later, she approached Marcus directly, her voice low, her Latin careful. "Order has broken," she said. Not accusation, statement. Marcus followed her gaze to the auxiliaries, to the road's blind curve. His jaw set. He summoned the centurion, demanded names. The answers were evasive. Rome's machinery resisted turning on itself. Marcus knew the limits of his authority and felt them like walls closing in. That night, Cassia gathered the women close and spoke plainly, not of what had been done, but of what would be done next. No one walked alone. No one lagged. If taken, note time, place, faces. Memory would be their weapon when weapons were denied. They agreed without discussion. Consent was no longer a luxury. The road turned southeast, climbing into scrubland where bones surfaced after rain, old and bleached. Cassia wondered whose they were. Traitors, soldiers, captives. Roads did not distinguish. Rome paved over all of it and called it progress. Marcus confronted the auxiliary commander at dawn. Voices were kept low, but the air sharpened. The commander shrugged, spoke of necessity, of men kept from home. Marcus reminded him of orders, of consequences. The commander smiled thinly and said Rome needed results more than virtue. Marcus walked away feeling older than he had the day before. By midday, the women's pact was tested. A child wandered from the line, chasing a lizard. Before a guard could react, 2 women moved as one, intercepting, returning the child, closing ranks. The moment passed. Cassia felt something like pride and something like grief. They were learning too fast. At a river crossing, the column paused to water animals and men. The women were kept back. Cassia watched reflections shatter under hooves. She thought of the valley where treaties had been sworn. She thought of Brennus counting steps. She felt the weight of leadership settle heavier. She did not want it. Want had nothing to do with it. That evening, Marcus ordered additional guards placed near the women, rotated from the legionaries, excluding auxiliaries. It was a small victory, fragile and costly. Cassia noted it, acknowledged it with a nod he pretended not to see. As darkness fell, the road hummed with insects and distant movement. Cassia lay awake, listening to the breathing around her, the shared rhythm of people refusing to fracture. She understood then that Rome's greatest mistake was not cruelty, it was predictability. Roads taught patterns. Patterns could be learned. Somewhere beyond the rise, an auxiliary laughed and was silenced. Marcus stared into the fire and imagined a road that ended. Cassia closed her eyes and sharpened memory into resolve. The road stretched on, paved with bone and silence, but it also carried witnesses. Rome had built it so. The road widened again, as if inviting confidence, and that was when Cassia knew the balance was shifting. Rome relaxed only when it believed resistance had been trained out of the body. The women felt it too, the easing of pace, the guards' shoulders dropping, the auxiliaries drifting back into the line like a returning illness. Comfort was a test. They camped near a junction where a newer road split toward the coast. Merchants passed under escort, wagons heavy with oil and wine, their drivers careful not to stare too long. Cassia counted the wheels, the animals, the guards. Movement meant information. Information meant leverage. Senna walked again, slower, her eyes clearer but distant. Cassia stayed close, speaking when necessary, silent when not. Trauma, Cassia understood, was a language that rejected force. It required patience, repetition, choice. Rome offered none of those. The women would. Marcus Varro received sealed orders at midday. He broke the wax and felt his stomach tighten. The governor wanted results. Compliance from the northern tribes had stalled. A demonstration was authorized, discreet but decisive, to be carried out if resistance continued. The language was precise, bloodless. Custody could be adjusted. Pressure could be increased. Marcus folded the orders carefully, as if neatness could change their meaning. That night, Cassia called the women together under the pretense of warmth. They huddled close, sharing cloaks, sharing breath. Cassia spoke quietly, each word chosen. "Rome believes we are separate," she said, "that fear divides. It does not. What happens to one will be remembered by all. That is our strength." She outlined rules, not plans, signals, distances, responses. If one was taken, two would follow at a distance. If harm was threatened, noise would be made. Not screams, but words, names, appeals to witnesses. Rome feared witnesses more than blades. They agreed, not loudly, not ceremonially. Agreement settled among them like a second skin. Cassia felt the weight of it, the midpoint between endurance and action. There would be no turning back. The test came sooner than expected. At dawn, a messenger arrived with news of another skirmish, larger this time. The auxiliaries stirred. The commander smiled, with teeth showing. Marcus felt the orders burn against his chest. He delayed, citing logistics, waiting for clarity that would not come. During the afternoon halt, an auxiliary reached for Senna's arm, not roughly, casually, as if claiming property. Cassia moved without thought, stepping between them, her voice firm. "No," she said in Latin. The word landed hard. The auxiliary laughed and tightened his grip. Cassia raised her voice, not screaming, but carrying. She named Marcus Varro. She named the prefect at Oratio. She named the law as it had been recited. Heads turned. Legionaries looked up. Merchants paused. The auxiliary cursed and shoved her aside. Two women followed, just as agreed, calling out, invoking order, invoking Rome's own language. The moment stretched, fragile as glass. Marcus was there then, dismounting, his face pale with fury. He ordered the auxiliary seized. The commander protested. Marcus repeated the order, louder. Legionaries moved. The auxiliary was disarmed, dragged back, his laughter gone. Silence fell. Marcus knew what he had done. He had chosen witnesses over expedients. He had broken the logic of quiet cruelty. The commander stared at him with cold calculation. The women watched, hearts pounding, memory etching itself deeper. That night, the auxiliary was flogged, publicly, precisely. It was punishment enough to be seen, not enough to erase what had been attempted. Rome corrected deviations, not intentions. Cassia watched from the edge, her expression unreadable. She understood this was not justice, it was a crack. Later, Marcus sought Cassia out under the pretense of inspection. He kept his distance, spoke softly. "You risked much," he said. She met his gaze evenly. "So did you," she replied. It was not gratitude, it was acknowledgement. Between them lay a thin, dangerous bridge. The women's pact hardened into practice. They moved in patterns now, subtle, adaptive. They spoke to legionaries when auxiliaries approached, invoking rules, drawing eyes. They learned which merchants would look, which would turn away. They learned the names of places, of officers, of dates. Cassia kept the tablets hidden, updating them at night, then erasing and memorizing, leaving no evidence but herself. Marcus wrote another report, this one careful, emphasizing improved discipline, minimized incidents. He did not mention the governor's orders. He could feel the midpoint approaching, the place where a road either turned or revealed its destination. He slept poorly, dreaming of milestones with no names. On the 7th day after the junction, the column reached a river town with stone quays and a market that buzzed despite the escort. The women were kept visible, arranged near the square. The governor's idea, executed. Cassia scanned the crowd, noting faces that lingered, eyes that sharpened. News traveled faster than legions. A speaker mounted the platform to announce tariffs and law. As he spoke, Senna stepped forward and addressed the crowd in a clear voice, her hands steady. She did not describe harm, she described custody. She named the road, the dates, the places. Cassia felt the oath they had made tighten like a drawn bow. Guards moved. Marcus raised a hand, hesitating, weighing. The crowd murmured. Witnesses leaned in. The speaker faltered. Marcus stepped forward and declared a recess, citing order. Senna was guided back, unharmed. The moment passed, but it had been seen. Cassia felt the pivot lock into place. They were no longer only enduring, they were shaping the field. That night, Marcus burned the governor's orders in his brazier, watching the wax melt, the words blacken. He knew the consequences would come. Cassia lay awake, listening to the river slap the quays, the sound of movement, of commerce, of attention. The midpoint had been crossed, the oath held. Roads could be learned, roads could be turned. The town woke to rumor before it woke to light. By the time the market stalls were raised and the river mist thinned, the story had already changed hands 3 times, each telling sharper than the last. A woman had spoken, a Roman officer had paused, order had hesitated, and hesitation in an empire built on momentum was an event. Marcus Varro felt the pressure by mid-morning. Messages arrived from the governor's aides, carefully worded inquiries that pretended not to know what they asked. He responded with precision, citing crowd management, prevention of unrest, adherence to protocol. He did not mention Senna's name. He did not mention the way the crowd had leaned forward, hungry not for spectacle, but for confirmation. Cassia sensed the shift without being told. Guards watched more closely now, not with hunger, but calculation. The women were kept visible longer, rotated through public spaces under escort, as if exposure might dilute their words. Rome believed in saturation. If everything was seen, nothing would be noticed. But witnesses multiplied. A fishmonger spoke to a sailor spoke to a dock clerk. A clerk wrote to his brother inland. The story lost its edges and gained a spine. Women taken as custody, roads marked by silence, an officer who had not struck when he could have. Rome's power had always depended on the certainty that stories ended where orders began. This one did not. The column resumed its march 2 days later under tighter formation. Legionaries replaced auxiliaries at the women's flanks. The auxiliary commander rode back with his men, expression unreadable. Marcus knew the reprieve was temporary. Rome corrected, then recalibrated. The road climbed into gentler country, fields stitched with low stone walls, vineyards pruned to obedience. Cassia watched farmers pause in their work, shading their eyes to see. Some made signs against bad luck. Some nodded, acknowledging a truth they could not speak. Witnesses did not need words to recognize each other. That night, a messenger reached the camp from Rome itself, his horse lathered, his seal intact. The letter was brief. The Senate had questions. Provincial practices were under review. Discretion was advised. Marcus felt both relief and dread. Review meant delay. Delay meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant someone would be sacrificed to restore confidence. He did not know yet who. Cassia gathered the women and adjusted their rules. Fewer words, more presence. When moved into public spaces, they stood straighter, not defiant, simply visible. They learned to look directly at observers, to return gaze without pleading. It unsettled people more than tears would have. Humanity, when unashamed, was disruptive. A trader offered Cassia an apple as they passed through a village. A small thing, quickly done, easily denied. Cassia accepted it, thanked him in Latin, and shared it among the children. The act traveled faster than the fruit. Kindness, like cruelty, was contagious. Marcus received another letter, this one from an old mentor, now seated in Rome. The language was careful, affectionate. Be prudent, be exact. Remember that systems survived individuals. Marcus understood the warning. The empire would endure. He might not. The women reached a hill where the road bent and revealed a vista of tiled roofs and a distant aqueduct arcing like a promise. A city lay ahead, larger than the town they had left. a place where governors entertained and decisions calcified. Cassia felt the gravity of it pull. Cities were crucibles, witnesses condensed there. At the gates, the women were arranged in a formal line. A magistrate emerged, flanked by scribes. He read names, compared lists, nodded. Procedures wrapped the moment in legitimacy. Cassia answered when called, her voice clear. She felt the eyes on her, measuring not her body, but her steadiness. Inside, they were quartered in a former bathhouse, drained and repurposed. Marble held the day's heat. Echoes lingered. Cassia traced the carvings, gods rendered smooth by centuries of touch. Empires layered themselves on stone. The stone remembered everything. Marcus met with the governor that evening. The man was urbane, amused, tired. He spoke of optics, of balance, of the need to reassure allies. He suggested transferring some of the women deeper south, dispersal as solution. Marcus argued for continuity, for minimizing movement. Movement created witnesses. The governor smiled thinly and said Rome would decide. That night, Senna spoke again, quietly, to a servant who brought water. Not accusations, facts, dates. The servant listened, nodded once, and said nothing. In the morning, a pamphlet appeared in the forum, anonymously posted, its Latin rough but readable. It did not accuse, it listed. The city stirred. The governor ordered it removed. Copies multiplied. Marcus walked the streets, helmet off, feeling the city's pulse change. He saw glances exchanged, conversations cut short when officials passed. He realized then that Rome's greatest vulnerability was not rebellion, but attention. Empires could crush armies. They struggled with being watched. Cassia stood in the bathhouse doorway and felt the same current. She understood that they had become an argument Rome could not easily win, not because they were strong, but because they were consistent. Memory had become a structure, as real as any wall. An order came at dusk. The women were to be moved at first light, destination undisclosed. Marcus read it twice. He knew what it meant. Removal before inquiry concluded. Silence restored by distance. He sought Cassia out one last time, his words measured, his eyes honest. "Be ready," he said. It was not instruction, it was warning. Cassia inclined her head. She did not thank him. Thanks implied debt. That night, the city did not sleep. Somewhere a bell rang. Somewhere else, a door closed too hard. Cassia lay awake among the women, listening to the layered sounds of an empire adjusting. She felt no triumph, only momentum. Witnesses, she understood, did not end systems. They changed how systems moved. As dawn approached, Cassia committed every detail to memory. The smell of marble, the cadence of guards, the shape of the aqueduct against the dark. Rome was watching itself now, and that, more than any blade, had begun to draw blood. They were moved before dawn, just as promised, but the city did not let them leave quietly. Word had traveled overnight, carried by servants and scribes, by dockhands and wives who had read the lists and understood their shape. When the gates opened, a crowd had already gathered, thin at first, then swelling, held at bay by a line of legionaries whose shields reflected torchlight and unease in equal measure. Cassia walked at the front, her posture unchanged, her eyes forward. She felt the presence of the crowd like heat against her skin. Names were spoken softly as the women passed, not accusations, but recognition. Senna's hand brushed Cassia's sleeve. Steady now. Whatever Rome intended next, the city had already absorbed what it could not unlearn. Marcus Varro rode beside the column, his face set, his thoughts moving faster than the horse's hooves. He had argued against the move until argument became insubordination by another name. The order had been clear. Distance would dilute attention. Rome would regain its rhythm. Half a mile beyond the gates, the rhythm broke. A rider approached its speed from the south, bearing the insignia of the governor's office and the seal of an inquiry commission. The column halted. Marcus read the order once, then again. Proceedings were to pause. Statements were to be collected. Witnesses were to be identified and preserved. Rome had decided to listen, if only to decide what to forget. The auxiliaries were summoned back as a precaution. The women were led into a temporary encampment erected with unusual haste. Scribes arrived, ink already mixed. Questions followed, carefully phrased, their danger hidden in grammar. Cassia answered when addressed, sticking to facts, refusing speculation. dates, places, names. She did not describe harm, she described custody, transfers, visibility, the shape of a system. Others spoke too. Senna, her voice steady. Alice, a widow whose name Marcus had never learned and now would not forget. Their accounts aligned, not because they had rehearsed, but because reality had been consistent. Consistency unnerved the scribes more than outrage would have. The governor arrived by noon, his manner controlled, his eyes bright with calculation. He watched the proceedings, intervened only to redirect language, to protect abstractions. Rome did not deny acts, it denied intent. Excesses were framed as deviations. Custody, he insisted, was protective. Any harm was regrettable, anomalous. Cassia waited until she was addressed again. Then she spoke, not loudly, but so the words carried. She named the methods without detail. She named the purpose without accusation. It is meant to be unspeakable, because what cannot be spoken cannot be answered. The scribes paused. The governor frowned. Marcus felt the moment tip. A murmur spread through the gathered officials and guards. The phrase took root, repeated, translated. Unspeakable was a word Rome understood. It had been used before, in debates about slavery, about conquest, about the margins of law. It was a word that suggested risk. By afternoon, the inquiry expanded. Merchants were called, servants. Legionaries rotated in for questioning, their answers cautious, rehearsed. Some avoided Cassia's gaze, some met it and looked away quickly. The auxiliaries were kept separate. Their commander sat alone, jaw tight, realizing too late that he had been useful only until scrutiny arrived. Marcus testified near sunset. He spoke of orders, of discipline, of interventions made and refused. He spoke carefully, naming procedures rather than people. He did not protect the governor. He did not condemn the empire. He let the structure show itself through its joints. The commission withdrew to deliberate. Rome's machinery hummed, gears meshing, calculations made. Outside the tent, the women waited, sharing water, sharing silence. Cassia felt the fatigue settle deep, a cost paid in advance. She did not know the outcome. She knew only that the unspeakable had been given a shape others could recognize. At dusk, a decision was announced. The women would not be dispersed. Custody would be transferred to the oversight of the commission pending further review. The auxiliary commander would be detained. Certain practices would be suspended. The language was bloodless. The effect was not. The crowd that had followed at a distance pressed closer. There was no cheer, only a collective exhale, as if something heavy had been shifted. Marcus felt no victory. He felt exposure. He had stepped into a light that did not distinguish between bravery and folly. That night, under guard more watchful than before, Cassia sat with the women and took stock. Nothing was over. Rome adapted faster than it repented, but the road ahead had changed. It now ran through an argument Rome could not entirely silence. Marcus stood apart, writing by lantern. He composed a letter to his mentor and tore it up. He began another, addressed to no one, and sealed it. Ritual again, standing in for certainty. Beyond the camp, fires dotted the hills where travelers waited, unwilling to pass without understanding what had shifted. Stories moved among them, gaining strength through repetition. The unspeakable had been named. Naming did not heal, it constrained. Cassia lay back and stared at the stars, the same ones that had watched treaties sworn and broken. She felt the weight of leadership ease slightly, replaced by something sharper, responsibility to truth now shared. She did not know how Rome would answer in the end. She knew only that it had been forced to listen to witnesses it had meant to erase. The night deepened. Guards changed. Ink dried on statements that would travel far beyond this camp. Rome would respond, as it always did, with adjustments and narratives. But somewhere along the road, a line had been crossed. The unspeakable had been revealed not through spectacle, But through accumulation, Cassia closed her eyes, letting exhaustion take her. Memory remained awake, patient and exact, waiting for the next turn of the road. The Commission's camp became a knot of authority pulled too tight. Standards flew that did not belong together, their symbols crowding the same air, each claiming precedence. Orders contradicted themselves. Guards were doubled, then replaced. Rome, when watched, began to argue with its own reflection. Cassia felt the pressure shift from blunt force to precision. The women were no longer marched for display. They were contained, preserved as evidence. Custody had changed hands, but not intent. Power had simply changed its posture. She warned the others quietly. Containment was not safety, it was preparation. Marcus Varro was summoned twice in one day, questioned by men who spoke as if they were neutral and wrote as if they were not. He realized then that Rome had already chosen its narrative. Excesses would be blamed on auxiliaries and poor oversight. The system would survive intact. Someone would be offered to the record as proof of accountability. That someone, Marcus suspected, might be him. The spark came unexpectedly and small. A junior scribe, nervous and eager, attempted to remove Cassia's tablets during an inspection, citing procedure. Cassia refused calmly. Words escalated. A guard stepped forward. The women closed ranks, silently, exactly as they had practiced since the road. The moment drew eyes. Witnesses leaned in again. Marcus intervened, ordering the tablets returned. The scribe protested, citing authority higher than Marcus's. Marcus repeated the order, louder. For a breathless second, command itself wavered. Then a legionary moved, not toward Cassia, but beside Marcus. Others followed. The standard-bearer hesitated, then planted the eagle firmly in the ground. It was not rebellion, it was alignment. Legionaries understood lines better than politics. In that instant, the line was clear. The Commission's lead magistrate arrived to restore order, his voice sharp, his patience thin. He declared Marcus relieved of command pending review. Marcus accepted without protest. Resistance now would fracture what little leverage remained. Cassia watched it happen and understood the cost that had been paid on her behalf. She met Marcus's eyes once, held them. No thanks, no promises, just recognition. The fallout was immediate. Auxiliaries were dismissed entirely. The women were formally reclassified, not as hostages, but as protected persons under inquiry. Language shifted. Protection replaced custody. It was imperfect, provisional, but it mattered. That night, Marcus packed his kit under guard. His career was over, or would be reshaped into something unrecognizable. He felt no regret, only a strange steadiness. Rome would continue, it always did, but it would remember this disruption, however it tried to bury it. Cassia gathered the women and spoke one sentence only. Stand as you have stood. They did. No cheers, no tears. The standard still planted in the dirt caught the firelight, its shadow stretching long and crooked across the camp. Rome had turned its standard slightly, not enough to change direction, but enough to admit resistance existed. Sometimes, Cassia knew, that was all history allowed. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since the valley, it was no longer owned entirely by Rome. The road ahead smelled of smoke before they saw it. A village had burned, charred beams jutting into the sky like accusations. Marcus Varro rode ahead, assessing damage, counting casualties, cataloging witnesses. Cassia walked with the women, keeping them in line, hearts and feet measured, minds alert. The air was thick with tension, each inhale bitter with ash. The auxiliary commander had escaped during the previous night's confusion, aided by loyalists who had been hidden among the observers. Rumors spread instantly, whispers of revenge, of reprisals, of vengeance cloaked as order. The column stiffened, aware that the empire's reach would follow, but uncertain if it could reach fast enough. At the first checkpoint, they were halted. Legionaries and auxiliaries converged, but discipline had fractured. Marcus recognized hesitation, felt fear mirrored in the faces of men who had always obeyed. Cassia stepped forward, using nothing but gaze and posture, aligning the women silently, signaling readiness. The line of witnesses had become a weapon. Chaos erupted when a rider charged, signaling the return of those loyalists. Shields collided, horses screamed. The fire spread faster than anyone could calculate. Flames licked at the road's edges, smoke curling over stone walls and wheat fields alike. Amid the clamor, Cassia moved with purpose, retrieving the children, guiding the women through narrow gaps between men and fire. Marcus fought alongside legionaries, not commanding, only holding a wedge of order against the surge. The column, trained in obedience, adapted instinctively to protect those it had once marched as captives. When the flames receded, scorched ground marking the distance, they were exhausted but intact. Rome's lesson had been disrupted, the unspeakable witnessed and survived. At dusk, as smoke settled over the horizon, Cassia traced the burned road with her eyes. Memory was their only map, and it had been sharpened by fire. Victory was not glory, it was survival, unbroken, witnessed, and unforgettable. The road was quiet at dawn, littered with ashes and footprints. The fire had left its mark, both on the land and on those who had endured it. Cassia led the women forward, each step measured, each glance catalogued. They were free in the sense that Rome no longer controlled their immediate movement, but the cost was written in their bones. Marcus Varro walked beside them, no longer an officer, but a witness. His armor had been removed, replaced by plain clothes, the insignia of rank dissolved into the dust of the burned road. He had lost position, reputation, certainty, but had kept something else, the one thing Rome could never fully erase: conscience. At a small river crossing, Cassia paused. The water mirrored the sky, bright and calm, as if mocking the violence that had passed. She turned to the women, naming names, remembering faces. Memory itself had become their strongest weapon, not vengeance, not triumph, but the unbroken record of what had been done and survived. A messenger arrived from the governor, tentative, carrying orders to report to the provincial capital. Rome had adapted. It would reconstruct, rewrite, repress. Cassia received the message without fear. She understood the empire's strength and its limits. They would move, but they carried the story with them, stitched into their presence, impossible to erase. As they walked, children clutched hands, women supported each other, and Marcus followed, silently cataloging the lesson he had learned too late for rank or recognition. Rome would continue. Empires always did. But what remains when fear no longer speaks? Memory, witnesses, names remembered. At sunset, the women stopped on a hill overlooking the distant city. The road stretched behind them, burned and scarred, yet whole. Cassia lifted her head and exhaled slowly. Rome had taken much, but it had not taken their witness. And in that, they found a new form of defiance, one that no legion, no standard, no law could ever extinguish. The empire endured, so did they.